Welcome to part 2 of the 722.6 rebuild. I am right in the middle of the rebuild process currently. I've got the entire transmission taken apart except for the pistons. The pistons have not been removed yet. I had to make custom tools for that. More on that a little later. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, which is actually removing the transmission from the car, I'll go ahead and link that in the description below. I'll also link below part 3 when that does come out, which is reinstalling the transmission. And I'll link the valve body rebuild, which I did a few months earlier. That'll also be down in the description. So with everything taken apart thus far, I'll go ahead and show you all the tools I've needed in order to get this thing apart so far. I've needed a T45 to remove all the bolts that hold the bell housing onto the front of the transmission housing here. And I've needed a T30 in order to remove the pan bolts as well as the valve body bolts that hold the valve body onto the bottom of the transmission. You'll see why you need to remove the valve body later. I've also needed a 7mm socket. Does not have to be deep well, but a 7mm socket in order to remove this electrical connector here, the electrical plug. If you have not replaced this on your transmission, I would highly advise that you replace it. The O-rings on here go bad, and it's very, very common for these transmissions to leak here. Also, you'll hear this heater running in the background. It's about 10 degrees out here, guys, so cut me a little bit of slack for that noise. It's definitely needed. Also, a screwdriver here for removing the snap rings, as well as a pair of pliers here for removing the snap rings. There's a couple that are actually inside the transmission housing in there, and having a pair of long pliers to go all the way back in there has definitely helped. You're going to need a pair of snap ring pliers to remove some of the snap rings on the drums and the shafts. And then a hammer. This is just a lead hammer I had laying around. You don't need a lead hammer, but this is what I used in order to knock out a couple of the bolts that separate the pump from the bell housing. Also, guys, a tool that is needed in order to change or at least remove the pistons is a tool that actually compresses the springs that hold the pistons back, the return springs. So in order to remove the pistons, you actually have to remove these return springs. On those pistons is an O-ring. I don't know the condition of those O-rings, but if I'm going to go to the trouble of taking this transmission apart, I definitely want to replace those O-rings. The only piston that is not metal is the B1 piston up here. I'm not going to flip that over. You'll see it later in the rebuild. But that piston is actually molded. It's a rubber type piston. I think it's actually rubber vulcanized around aluminum. But that piston is commonly replaced because that rubber will wear out. I'm not replacing it because I haven't had any problems with the B1 piston engaging. But in order to remove these pistons, guys, you need a special set of press tools. You can buy them on Amazon pretty cheaply. I'll throw a picture over here to show you what they look like. For like 20, 30 bucks or so. That will work for the majority of pistons, but the difference with this transmission is you have to press on the spring itself and not a cup that encases the spring itself. And in order to do that, I've actually had to make these tools here. These are essentially flat steel. They're 1/8 inch thick steel that I've bent into a circle, welded these rods on, and then I have this, which this inserts into. It will allow me to put this tool over this spring area here and then remove the snap ring that's on the inside. If I put washers under here and then a center rod down here, it'll allow me to press underneath and push down on this this ring here, which will compress the spring and allow me to remove the snap ring. I'll show you how to use this tool when we actually get to that point in the rebuild. As far as the specs of this tool here, each one of these rings, I have 3 different rings in here. This one here is 3 inches in diameter, outside diameter. This one here is 4 inches in outside diameter. And then this one here is about 6 inches in outside diameter. It's anywhere between 5 3/4 to 6 inches in diameter. This ring is here. And then this one here, this is actually a little bit different. This is a little bit different of a story when you try and remove the piston from the K3 drum right here. The K3 drum, as you can see, there's not a hole going through it. It's a blind hole. So what needs to be done is this is going to slip over this shaft and then will be used to help press out from the other side the piston that's in there. Like I said, I'll show how to use all these tools when it comes time to actually remove those pistons. That's it for tools, guys. Let's go ahead and rewind back to the beginning of the disassembly and show you how that's done. All right, transmission's out on the workbench. Let's just dig right into it. Let's just start out. It's probably gonna be messy, but we'll go ahead and remove the torque converter. There we go. This torque converter is being replaced, by the way. I've got a new one already set to go. I'm going to go around and remove all the T45s. All right, I've got all those T45s out. I believe all of these Torx bolts here, that is what actually holds on the first planetary set. The pump and everything is attached to the bell housing on the trans, so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can pull this off. Oh wait, no, we've got a bolt here and a bolt here on the back side. I'm going to use a lead hammer. Rubber hammer would also work, wooden mallet, anything like that to attempt to get this off. There she goes. You will notice everything in this transmission is extraordinarily clean. Over the last probably 5,000 to 10,000 miles, I've run the equivalent of probably 4 gallons of new trans fluid through this thing to do kind of like a over-the-time flush with it. Sprag appears to be good. The sprag is going to make this thing free spin counterclockwise and then lock in the clockwise direction, which is what it's doing. We go ahead and look at all of the teeth of that helical gear there, and it looks fantastic. We can go ahead and pull off this first section here. It looks wonderful, actually. Okay, and here is the general rule of how all of the friction material here is held together in these transmissions. It's held in with a snap ring right here. You use either a screwdriver or a pair of pliers or something to pull that snap ring off, just like that. Actually, I can do it with my fingers. You've got 2 needle bearings. You've got one here, and then you've got one here as well, both of which are not scored, and they look wonderful. Pop this snap ring out here. All right, all of these bolts here, these are T45s. I'm gonna go ahead and pull out all these bolts, leave 2 in, and then you're gonna take a small punch, or even you just use your bit there with an extension, and you're gonna lightly tap on either one of them. That's gonna drive out your pump, which actually sits on the inside of the bell housing here. Make sure you separate the front bolts, basically anything that's not touching transmission fluid from anything that is touching transmission fluid. As with anything else, whether it's injection systems, transmissions, inside engines, contamination is the #1 cause of failure. This is going to drop straight down out of the bell housing. There it goes. I'm going to go ahead and set this pump on a clean rag, and we will pull it apart and take a look at it. That gear should pull straight up. Take a look at the teeth of the gear pump, make sure it's not scored. This looks fantastic. And then we'll pull out the outer ring here. Now this outer ring is actually a bearing surface. So you've got a bearing surface here, which looks very good. No nicks, no scrapes. And then also look at where that outer race rides on. It all looks very, very good. All right, I got the bell housing back in front of me again. What we're gonna do is we're gonna remove B here. We're gonna move the B1. We're gonna take the bell housing and flip it over. All right, and then inside here, we've got T30s, several of them. I'm gonna go ahead and remove all those. All right, and then just as with the pump, we're gonna go ahead and whack these here with the threads in just a little bit. And there we go, we have separation. And then here we have the seal plate. I'll go ahead and carefully peel this off. Just peel up the corners, and it'll free the entire thing, and it'll pull right off, just like that. Next, we're going to pull out the shaft that goes into the torque converter. Oh, I'm hitting. I got to take the valve body out. That's wonderful. Looking forward to that. We cannot remove this drum assembly here until the valve body has been removed. We're hitting that speed sensor. So I'm going to go ahead and pop the pan off, pull the valve body out. That will allow us to pull this drum out. All right, so in order to take the valve body off, you've got to remove the pan, and then also don't forget to take this electrical connector out of here. It's a 7mm socket. The pan bolts are all T30s. Okay, all of the valve body bolts are all Torx as well. They're all T30s, just like the pan bolts. Okay, the valve body will now pull straight out. We'll go ahead and pull this first drum out. There is a snap ring right along here that holds this gear in here. We'll go ahead and pop that out. We can then remove this entire drum from the inner spindle with that snap ring removed. So in order to take out the rest of the drum that's in there, you need to take the yoke off the back end of the transmission. The nut that's on here is a 30mm 12-point socket. I have one right here. You're going to need a deep well. This nut has a keeper on it. It was actually hammered in right there, so basically what you need to do, don't use a screwdriver, use an actual chisel, and then hammer up on there. Once that's done, you should just be able to zip this thing off. Just like that. And the yoke should pull right off. It should not be rusted on. The ball bearing on this end seems nice and tight still. Then in here, in order to remove that drum, we have one more snap ring that needs to be removed. You're going to want a long pair of pliers for this, something like these. Come in there, you might not be able to see it, but I'll pull the snap ring out and show it to you. There's that snap ring right there. You gotta find the end of it, pry it up and out, and it'll come out. Once that snap ring's removed, we should be able to just pull that drum straight out of there. Alright, so what we have here is the output stage of the transmission. I'm going to disassemble this end first. What we have here is a bearing and a snap ring. We'll go ahead and pull that snap ring off first. You're going to need a pair of snap ring pliers, obviously, to take off snap rings. Okay, we got that snap ring off. We then have seal rings here. They're hard plastic, essentially, and work just like a piston ring. We're taking these rings off to make it easier to pull off this drum here. Second ring off. Now we have a bearing assembly here, which is a needle bearing sandwiched between two plates. So we've got a plate on the top and then a plate on the bottom here as well. So it goes on just like this. You have this plate on the bottom, then you have your needle bearing, and then your plate on the top. This should then slide right off. It is splined on the inside. You have a sprag in here as well, facing this end, the splined end, not the gear end. It should rotate freely clockwise, and then lock when rotating counterclockwise. Your planetary drum here will then pull straight off. You've got a bearing right there, as well as 2 more of these seal rings on here. On the other end of this shaft, you have a bearing that sits in like this. Inside here, we have another clutch pack set. We're gonna pull this off. And I'm gonna dump all of these out the bottom. These are single-sided frictions. You'll notice you got steel on the back, and then you've got your friction material on the front. We then have this, which is the input shaft side. We have another snap ring right here holding these frictions in. These frictions are actually double-sided, so you have friction material on both sides and then a steel in between. Go ahead and remove the frictions from this drum as well, just as all the others. It has a snap ring. This clutch pack is single-sided. You've got your friction material here and then steel on the back. Now, it may be hard to see in here, guys, but we actually have 2 more sets of frictions of clutches in here. The snap ring that I pulled out in here earlier releases the first set of clutches. I'm going to go ahead and pull those out right now. Here's the first set. We've got double-sided frictions here with steels in between. This snap ring was a little trickier to get out than all the rest, just because of the way that it's fastened in. There's not as big of openings around this snap ring in order to get it out. I'll go ahead and pull these frictions out here now. And we have, looks like we have double-sided frictions here as well with steels in between. It may not look like there's anything left in there after those 2 clutch packs have come out, but there actually is. And it will not come out unless you remove these 2 bolts. There's one right there, right there. They're T45s as well. This assembly should come out right now. And there we go. We've got this baby here as well. Do not forget this little spacer at the bottom here. It sits on the inner race of the output shaft bearing down there, that ball bearing. Alright guys, this is the first drum that we're going to remove the piston from. As you can see here, this is the spring. It's kind of bad lighting, but I'll do as best I can. This is the spring here, and then on the outside right there, that is your snap ring all the way along there. So what the snap ring is actually doing is it's holding all this in as well as holding this spring down. This snap ring is actually in the shape of an L. So what we need to do in order to release the snap ring is take the tension off the spring. To do that, I'm going to use this tool. It's going to sit right on the spring there and push tension down. So here's the basic setup for the tool. You've got your ring here with your welded threaded rods onto this plate, and on the bottom side, I don't know if you can see, on the bottom side I've got 2 nuts. So when this plate pulls down, it pushes down on that ring. This center rod here, which is what's actually going to move it, on the bottom is held in place. So I've got 2 9/16 wrenches. That's what just so happens to fit the nuts that I have here. The more I tighten, the more that spring goes down. You don't want to go too far with the spring or you'll risk deforming it. You want to go just enough so that it starts to stop, and then that ring is exposed. So now we should be able to remove that ring and pop the piston out. Okay, the ring has been completely removed from its place. I'm just going to slowly kind of fish it out. There's the ring. And we should be able to completely remove tension now. Okay, so by flipping this over, that should remove the spring. Now the piston should be right down in there, and if we pull up, there, we can see the piston. There's the O-ring. It still seems to be in good shape, but I'm going to replace it anyway just to make sure. The trick is for getting these things in, guys, because this is the flat or the D-shaped O-ring that has the rounded outside corner, or that has the rounded outside lip, is to take it and insert it in here as best you can before you put the ring on. That way you can just kind of finagle it around like this, and it helps to make sure that the O-ring goes in the correct way. Make sure you're lubing it up well with transmission fluid, and then press it back in. Make sure, guys, that when you're putting these springs back in here that they go in the right way. This one is actually supposed to go in this way with the teeth, I guess you could call it, of the spring facing down. When you put the snap ring in there before you start compressing, it helps with getting it to seat, so then all you'd have to do at this point is just push it down after this is compressed. Alright, this snap ring should now just drop right in. Alright, that snap ring is seated all the way down. Next piston to remove is this bad boy. This has got a big flat spring that I'm going to use this 4-inch ring on here.
You should know that I'll be there day and night. Nobody else can love you better. I'm here just to treat you right. You're the reason I'm alive. You're the only pain I can endure. But when you're not here,
Alright guys, what I've done to remove this piston here is I've went in through the holes in the side here, and I've actually, with a screwdriver on either side, and I carefully pried up under this lip, a little bit at a time, and it helps work this thing up till eventually it popped out, and I could just pull it straight out. On here, there is an O-ring right here, which actually seems to be in good shape, but it's out, so I'll replace it anyway. There's also an O-ring. I don't know if you can see it. It's sitting right down here. When you pull it apart, you'll be able to see it. We're going to be doing this seal, and this seal for this thing. These ones on the ID, guys, are very hard because you got to work them quite a ways down there while still maintaining their shape. So what I recommend doing is very carefully just stretching it out just a little bit. I'm in the cold, so it tends to hold its shape a little bit better. And then wringing it down around here. Getting these inside O-rings, guys, is fairly difficult, but you got to be patient and persistent to make sure they go in correctly. Alright guys, so with the K1 drum here, make sure when you put this snap ring back in, don't ask me how I know this, do not let this top plate here where the snap ring sits in, do not let it go beyond the opening for the snap ring in here. I originally designed a 3-inch ring to go with this drum. I may still use it, but first I'm gonna go ahead and try the 4-inch ring and see how that works. Gives me a little bit more room to work. This snap ring is a little bit more difficult to get. Got to carefully work all the way around the piston. There it is, right there. We'll go ahead and back tension off. And there we go. We've got another piston ready to be pulled. Alright guys, so I've got B2 and B3 here together. They're actually one assembly. Let me show you what's going on with B2 and B3. This whole assembly is actually 2 pistons. You have this here, which is essentially 1 piston, but also inside of it, you have another piston for another clutch pack. So you'll have a clutch pack that sits and rides on top of here, and then you also have a clutch pack that sits and rides inside here. This piston is pushed up and down, sealed by an O-ring inside of this housing here, which bolts into the gear case for the transmission. Now it's a good thing I decided to open these 2 pistons up, because inside here it looks like we have quite a bit of residue of some type of particulate, most likely from the frictions. I'm gonna go ahead and clean all that out of there and then replace the O-rings. When putting this piston back together, make sure that this opening right here in this piston is right in between these 2 bolt holes right here. And then that presses in. Then the piston, this weep hole here, needs to be 12 o'clock from right where that opening is in this housing. This ring here has a lip right there, and then on the bottom right there. That needs to correspond to there, and there. There is actually a weep hole right there. That weep hole in that center piston needs to be 12 o'clock, exactly 12 o'clock, from the bolts here that go in to hold this through the transmission case. So you got your bolts here, center point there, lined straight up center with that weep hole. Alright guys, you are going to find that actually putting this snap ring in here before you compress this spring is actually going to make it easier to snap it back into place. This is the only snap ring that is flat. It takes a lot of tension in order to spread that thing open. Look at how simple that was. Snaps right into place. Here guys, you can begin to get a little bit of a picture on how this is supposed to work. I've got the center ring here on the on this plate. I've got holes drilled on the outside to put threaded rod on the outside. And then on the bottom here, we've got this, which is designed to slip over the shaft. You can see we're starting to press that spring down. There we go, guys. I got that one removed. Alright guys, so this is the cap for the return spring, which is here of the piston. This has an O-ring on the outside. Do not forget to change that. Here's what the inside of this thing looks like. Here's the piston. We've got an O-ring at the bottom here, and then we also have an O-ring down here where the ID of this rides. We're going to replace this seal, and this seal, which sits around the outside of that top cap. Make sure to measure each one of these O-rings when putting them on to make sure that if you have two O-rings that are very similar in the same package, make sure you're measuring the ones that are coming off to make sure they're the same size. With the snap ring back on, we can reduce pressure, and this drum's piston is done. Alright guys, I am going to call it quits for this video. The entire edited down rebuild ended up being just shy of an hour long, so I split it into two separate parts. Part 2 is going to be linked in the description below.